The ground trembled, sending waves of dust through the air. Erin's violet skin flickered with bioluminescent light as she stumbled, her feet barely keeping their footing. The entire underground facility groaned, as though the earth itself were about to swallow it whole. A loud boom followed by a heavy rumble shook the walls. Explosions echoed far above. Too close. She cursed under her breath, her wide, glowing blue eyes scanning the dark corridors of the research complex. She was supposed to be safely observing Earth's climate changes, keeping a low profile. She wasn't supposed to be running from explosions, debris, and the ever-encroaching destruction of her refuge. Erin's sharp senses picked up the sound of scrambling footsteps behind her. She turned, muscles tense, only to see her worst fear realized. A massive chunk of the ceiling above cracked, sending a storm of concrete raining down. Her hand shot out instinctively, but before she could react, a figure appeared, too close to avoid the falling debris. With a flash of movement, Erin darted forward, her alien strength surging as she grabbed the human. He was tall, broad-shouldered despite his worn appearance, with dark hair matted by sweat. His face was pale, blood streaking down his temple, but his eyes, brown, full of confusion and disbelief, met hers with shock. She didn't have time to second-guess herself. Erin lifted him as though he weighed nothing, pulling him out of the path of the falling rubble. The ground below cracked as they slid together toward the far wall. They collapsed to the floor, breathless. Erin's heart hammered in her chest, but her survival instinct took over. She turned to look at the man she had just saved. His body was half covered in dust, and his chest heaved with ragged breaths. For a moment, their eyes locked. His were wide, uncertain, the color of dark earth, a stark contrast to the soft blue glow of her skin. "You're not human," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Erin felt a pang in her chest. She wasn't surprised he had figured it out so quickly. Though she wasn't physically like humans, her presence alone in this wreckage should have been enough to tell him something was amiss. "No," she said softly, pushing herself to her feet and offering him a hand. "But I can help you." He hesitated, eyeing her hand before reluctantly taking it. "Rian," he said, his grip surprisingly firm despite the blood dripping down his face. "You're an alien, right? What the hell's going on here?" The reality of the situation hit her then, and she quickly looked around. The emergency lights flickered dimly, casting an eerie glow over the desolate, crumbling corridor. The facility was collapsing, and the only way out was deeper into the complex. "My name is Erin," she replied, pulling him up gently but swiftly. "This research base is under attack." "By who?" "By humans," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "We've been discovered." Rian's eyes widened, shock still lingering in his gaze. "What do you mean, discovered? Who would?" Another explosion shook the ground, louder this time, a violent tremor that sent them both stumbling. The emergency alarms blared in unison with the shaking walls. Red lights flashed, casting the place in a chaotic glow. The man staggered as he tried to regain his footing. "Listen," Erin said urgently, grabbing his arm. "We don't have time for questions. You need to follow me. There's a shelter deep inside the base, an emergency bunker. If we get there, we might survive." Rian, still dazed, nodded slowly. He seemed to recognize the urgency in her voice, though his expression was clouded with disbelief. Erin turned, leading the way down the hallway. The walls were lined with emergency signs, pointing toward the safety bunkers. Each sign flickered dimly, the red glow an eerie warning. As they moved, Erin's senses remained on high alert. There was no telling how long they had before the entire facility came down. Her mind raced, she needed to act quickly. She couldn't let Rian die here. He stumbled behind her, his steps uneven. He was clearly injured, his body starting to give in to the strain. But there was nothing she could do for him now, not when the whole place was crumbling around them. At last, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the shelter doors. Erin pressed her palm against the control panel, and the door opened with a slow, grinding sound. The moment they were inside, the door slammed shut with a heavy thud, locking them in. It was quiet now, The dust had settled, and only the hum of the emergency lights filled the space. Rian sank to the floor, clearly exhausted, his back against the wall. He groaned in pain, clutching his side where a deep gash had opened. Blood stained his shirt, and his skin was paler than it should be. Erin crouched beside him, her blue eyes scanning his injuries. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. He nodded, though it was clear he was struggling. Just a scratch. "I'll be fine." Erin didn't believe him, but she didn't press him further. There was something more important to focus on right now: survival. "This place isn't going to last long," she said. "We need to stay in here until we figure out how to get out. The outside is too dangerous." Rian looked at her, his eyes narrowed. "How long do you think we have?" She hesitated. The base was old, the outer walls weakened by the missile strikes. If she had to guess. "Not long," she finally said, her voice low and steady. "A few hours, maybe. But the emergency systems should hold. We just need to wait until we can assess the situation outside." Rian stared at her, then looked down at his hands, which were trembling from more than just the shock. He exhaled heavily. "Great." Erin reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "We'll make it through this. I won't let you die." Rian's gaze lifted to meet hers, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something more than fear in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. It was the first time he had spoken those words, and they lingered in the quiet of the shelter. But in that moment, despite the danger outside and the uncertainty of what lay ahead, Erin felt a strange warmth settle in her chest. Perhaps, against all odds, they would survive this together. The hours dragged on in the dim glow of the emergency lights. Dust still hung thick in the air, settling over everything like a heavy fog. The bunker, though safe for now, felt cold and sterile. Rian had settled against the wall, leaning with his head tilted back, his breathing shallow and irregular. Erin paced quietly, her mind racing. She had heard stories of humans, of their strength and resilience, but seeing Rian like this, weak, exhausted, fading, made her realize just how fragile they truly were. He was barely conscious now, his skin too pale, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. Her gaze flicked to him, and the knot in her stomach tightened. She couldn't let him die, even if he was human, even if it was against everything her people had ever believed in. The Zalari had always kept their distance from humans, not just because of the vast differences in biology, but because of the risk. They had never wanted to become too close. Bonds were dangerous, and the way Zalari formed connections was unlike anything humans could comprehend. But this wasn't about culture or rules anymore. This was survival. "Rian," she said quietly, kneeling beside him. He barely stirred, his eyes fluttering open but not focusing on her. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice weak. "No, you're not." Erin's voice was firm now. She could see it in his face, feel it in his pulse. His body was starving. Even with the blood loss, the real danger lay in his dehydration, his lack of energy. He needed nourishment, fast. The air felt thick as she hesitated. For a moment, she almost gave up on the idea, but then she looked at him again, his rough, weathered face, his eyes closed in weariness. He was barely holding on. She knew what she had to do. Erin's hand shook as she touched the sensitive area of her chest just below the collarbone. Her skin tingled in response, the bioluminescence flickering briefly. She inhaled deeply, trying to steady her breath, before gently urging the secretion from her body, a soft, glowing liquid that would sustain him. It was meant to nourish her people in times of need, and she had never once considered using it for another species. Yet here she was. Rian's eyelids fluttered, and he shifted slightly. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Erin, what is that?" "This will help you," she said quietly, her eyes steady, but her heart pounding. He blinked, clearly confused, then locked eyes with her. "What do you mean?" Erin's throat tightened. She hadn't anticipated how intimate this would feel, how vulnerable. "It's a nutrient-rich fluid. It will sustain you for a while. But only if you trust me." He looked at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. You're not going to hurt me?" His voice cracked slightly. Erin shook her head. No, I would never. But you have to drink it. You need it. Rian didn't respond. Instead, his gaze flickered down to her chest, where the liquid had begun to form, soft and iridescent. It was clear now that he had no other choice. His body was too weak, too far gone. His fingers trembled as he reached out, hovering over her skin for just a moment before pressing against it gently. Erin's breath caught, the sensation of his touch sending an unexpected shiver through her. He hesitated, then slowly, cautiously, his lips brushed against the glowing fluid. His body jerked slightly at the contact, and then he took a small, tentative sip. It was only a moment before his expression changed. His eyes widened in surprise, his posture shifting as if he could suddenly feel warmth flooding his veins. Rian gasped, breathing in deeply as the color seemed to return to his cheeks. He pulled away, looking at her in disbelief. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's from me," she said softly, her heart racing. "It's enough to sustain you for a while." He nodded slowly, his hand still resting on her skin. "It's incredible. I feel better." Relief washed over her. It was working. She had done what was necessary to keep him alive. But even as she told herself this, a strange warmth filled her chest. She wasn't just giving him nourishment. She was giving him part of herself. For the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the undeniable connection between them. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was something more. Something fragile, something unfamiliar. Rian exhaled deeply, his body still trembling but now with strength rather than weakness. "I don't know how to thank you," he muttered. Erin didn't know how to respond. The words she wanted to say caught in her throat, too complicated for this moment. Instead, she just nodded, her lips pressed together. "You've saved my life," he added quietly. "I thought I was going to die in here." She looked at him, the intensity of his gaze making her heart beat faster. The human had trusted her, in a way that no one ever had. The thought made her head spin. "I'll keep you safe," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking about survival or something deeper, something that was growing between them, something neither of them had expected. The silence between them was thick, filled with a sense of understanding and shared survival. They weren't just trapped in this bunker together anymore. Something had shifted, something unspoken. They were no longer just two strangers. They were something else. Section 3. The First Taste. The hours passed in a blur of silence. The bunker had become their sanctuary, a fragile barrier between them and the chaos of the collapsing facility above. Rian had finally fallen into a restless sleep, his breathing deep but still uneven. The glowing red lights flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the room. It was a moment of calm, but not for long. Erin kept her distance, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't fully process. Rian's condition was improving, but she knew it was temporary. His body had taken a toll, fighting hunger, thirst, blood loss. He needed more than just a brief moment of recovery. He needed something more than what she could offer. But even as her mind told her to be practical, to remember the reason she was here, to observe, not interfere, her heart pushed her in another direction. She couldn't help but think about the bond that had formed between them. The simple touch of his hand, the way he trusted her without question, despite everything that had happened. Erin shook her head, trying to push those thoughts aside. She couldn't afford distractions. She had to focus. But it was hard to ignore the pull she felt when she looked at him, even as he lay there, vulnerable, just a human among the stars. Rian stirred, his eyes slowly opening. He blinked a few times, adjusting to the dim light of the bunker. His gaze landed on her, and for a moment, it seemed like everything else in the world disappeared. "Hey," he said softly, his voice still hoarse. "How long was I out?" "A few hours," she replied, keeping her tone even. "You needed rest." He sat up slowly, wincing as he moved. His eyes flicked to the area where she had given him her nourishment. He hesitated before looking back at her. "I still don't understand," he murmured. "What was that stuff? Why are you helping me?" Aaron felt her chest tighten, her gaze flicking to the floor before meeting his again. "Because you needed it. You wouldn't have survived without it." Rian's brow furrowed. But that wasn't normal. It was like something out of a science fiction story. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "If only it were a story," she said quietly. "But sometimes, fiction is truer than reality." Rian laughed softly, though it sounded more like a cough. "Tell me about it." Aaron didn't answer right away, instead watching him carefully. He seemed stronger now, more alert. His eyes were still heavy with the weariness of everything that had happened, but there was a spark in them now. A sign that he was fighting to stay awake, fighting to survive. "Are you hungry?" she asked, her voice gentle. Rian nodded slowly, almost as if he hadn't realized how famished he was. "Yeah, a little," he said, rubbing his stomach. "I could eat a horse if I had the chance." Aaron could feel the tension in her body mount again. This wasn't something she had considered. She had given him her energy, her sustenance, but humans were different. Their bodies required more. She had to find a way to ensure he survived, even if it meant going against everything her people believed in. But the thought of doing more, of offering him something more, felt both wrong and necessary. She looked away, trying to hide the unease in her eyes. "I'll find something for you," she said, though she wasn't sure what that something could be. Rian didn't seem to notice her discomfort. He stretched his arms above his head, groaning slightly. "I can't believe I'm saying this, but thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you." Aaron's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her face neutral. "You don't need to thank me," she replied, though she felt the words fall hollow in her mouth. He didn't understand. He couldn't. Before she could say anything else, a rumble shook the bunker, followed by a loud crash from above. The ground trembled, and the emergency lights flickered once more. Aaron's senses went on high alert. The facility was collapsing faster than she had anticipated. The escape routes were becoming unstable. "Stay close," she ordered, moving quickly to the control panel. The lights dimmed further, casting long shadows against the walls. Rian followed her, his eyes wide with concern. "What's going on? What's happening?" "I need to get the airlock working," she replied quickly, her fingers moving over the controls. "The outer walls are failing. We need to get out before the entire place collapses." "Out!" Rian's voice rose. "Are you crazy? It's like a war zone out there." "I don't have a choice," she said sharply, her eyes not meeting his as she focused on the screens in front of her. "I can't stay here forever. And neither can you." Rian's face softened. "Aaron," he stepped forward, his hand landing on her arm. "You don't have to do this alone." Aaron froze, the warmth of his touch jolting through her like electricity. She pulled away instinctively, but the lingering feeling remained. "I'm not alone," she said quietly. "But I'm not letting you die in here." The words hit her harder than she expected. She wasn't just saying them to him. She was saying them to herself. Suddenly, the reality of their situation crashed over her again. They weren't just survivors in a bunker. They were two beings from completely different worlds, trapped together by chance, and by a growing bond neither could deny. Her thoughts broke off abruptly as the sound of crumbling concrete reached their ears, louder now. She had no time to dwell on it. There was no time to wonder what this strange connection between them meant. There was only survival. "Stay close," she said again, this time softer, almost tender. Rian nodded, though he still looked hesitant. He had come to depend on her in ways that were hard to explain, and the feeling was mutual. Even if she couldn't admit it yet, she knew it too. As they moved toward the exit, the lights flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging them into darkness. But somehow, Aaron knew they would survive. Together. The silence of the dark bunker was deafening. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of dust and metal. Aaron's glowing skin barely illuminated the space, and in the pitch black, her bioluminescence seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. She could feel Rian's presence behind her, his steps hesitant, his breath still ragged from the ordeal. The ground beneath their feet shook intermittently, reminding them both that time was slipping away. Erin pressed her palm to the cold metal door, the panel's lights flickering weakly as she tried to override the failing system. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but she didn't allow herself to feel panic. Panic wouldn't help them. She needed clarity. "We need to move faster," she murmured, her voice more forceful than she intended. "The walls won't hold much longer." Rian, still unsteady on his feet, nodded but didn't speak. His hand brushed against the wall, and Erin noticed him wince. The injuries he had sustained were still present, though less severe after the nourishment she had given him. But his body was fragile, and the physical toll was still evident. "I'm fine," he said, though his words were shaky. Erin glanced back at him. "No, you're not," she said bluntly. "But you will be if we get out of here. We don't have much time." The airlock system beeped, the screen flashing an error code. Erin's fingers moved across the console, her concentration intense. But the system was failing, just like everything else in the facility. She could feel it in her bones. This was the last chance to escape. "I'll have it open in a minute," she said, though the words felt hollow. Every second counted. Rian moved closer, standing just behind her. His hand hovered near her shoulder, as though unsure if he should touch her. Erin noticed it, and for the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the distance that had been slowly shrinking between them. There was a bond forming, something more than survival, more than just the moment. It was something strange, something neither of them could ignore. "What if we don't make it?" Rian asked quietly, his voice low but steady. Erin hesitated, her fingers still moving over the screen. She had never been one to dwell on the possibility of failure, but now, with Rian's question hanging in the air, she could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest. "We will," she replied firmly. "We don't have another choice." A tremor ran through the walls again, and the entire facility groaned in protest. The airlock system beeped again, and this time, a light blinked green. It was open. "Go," she urged, stepping aside.
"Now?"
Rian hesitated only for a moment before he moved forward, his body pushing through the opening. Erin followed close behind, the cold air of the outside world rushing in as the door slid shut behind them. They were outside. The sky above was dark, the distant sounds of explosions echoing through the air. But the stars shone brightly, untainted by the chaos below. The ground beneath their feet was rough, uneven. The world had been forever changed, and so had they. Erin scanned their surroundings, her heightened senses alert for any danger. The facility was now a smoldering wreck behind them, the outer walls crumbling in the aftermath of the attack. She had no idea who had attacked the base, or why, but there was no time to worry about that now. "Where do we go?" Rian's voice cut through the quiet, his eyes wide as he took in the destruction around them. "Follow me," Erin said, her voice calm but urgent. "I know a place where we can take shelter. It's not far from here." Rian nodded, his movements still stiff but more controlled. His injuries, though lessened, were far from healed. The blood loss had drained him more than he let on. "Are you sure you're okay?"
Erin asked, her voice softer this time.
"You've been through a lot." Rian offered her a tired smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm fine. But I think I'll take your word for it if you say we're almost there." They began moving, carefully navigating the rough terrain. The ground was uneven, littered with debris and the remains of the collapsed facility. The air smelled faintly of smoke, and the distant hum of the wreckage told them that they had little time before the rest of the facility fell completely. As they walked, Erin found her thoughts drifting. The connection between them, whatever it was undeniable now. There was a warmth growing in her chest every time their paths crossed. A bond that was more than just survival. A bond that felt like something deeper, something more intimate. She couldn't deny it anymore. Rian glanced at her again, his gaze searching, as if trying to read her thoughts. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice gentle. Erin looked at him, the vulnerability in his eyes catching her off guard. He was more than just a human now. He was someone she needed to protect, someone whose survival mattered to her more than anything else. She shook her head, the words escaping her before she could stop them. I'm just trying to figure out how to keep you alive. Rian stopped walking, his brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? Aaron stopped too, turning to face him fully. You're human, she said, the words coming out more sharp than she intended. And I'm not. You're fragile. You can't survive this on your own. Rian's eyes softened, and he took a step closer to her, his voice low. You're not alone either, you know? The words struck her harder than she expected. She wasn't sure what to say, but before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze. Erin's senses flared as she scanned the horizon. In the distance, a group of figures appeared, moving toward them with purpose. They weren't human. Get behind me, she whispered urgently, her body tensing. Rian stepped back, his eyes wide with fear. Who are they? Erin's voice was firm, but tinged with something else. I don't know, but we need to move.
Now.
The figures in the distance were drawing closer, their shapes growing more distinct as the minutes passed. Erin's heart rate quickened, not from fear, but from the instinctive need to protect. She had seen many types of beings during her travels, but these figures, they weren't familiar. They weren't from her world. Stay behind me, she whispered to Rian, her voice a low, urgent command. Her body tensed, ready for whatever confrontation might come. Rian's face tightened, his hand instinctively reaching for his side, where he had been carrying a crude weapon, a broken pipe he had found earlier. Erin's eyes flicked over to it, her lips parting slightly in a silent warning. That won't help, she said. These beings, they're not like us. Not like anything you've encountered. He looked at her, uncertainty flashing in his eyes, but he didn't argue. Instead, he tightened his grip on the pipe, not fully understanding the gravity of her words. Erin turned her attention back to the approaching figures, counting at least 5 of them. The silhouettes were angular, sleek, and their movements were coordinated, too coordinated to be human. Each step they took seemed deliberate, as if they were tracking something. A shiver ran down her spine. The way they moved reminded her of predators, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she wondered if they had somehow caught wind of her connection to Rian. Get down, Erin hissed, crouching low to the ground. Rian followed her quickly, his breath shallow, his eyes wide as he searched the approaching group. The harsh, unnatural hum of their footsteps was almost drowned out by the growing wind that swept across the barren landscape. They waited, hidden behind a jagged rock formation. Erin's mind raced. Who were they? What did they want? She hadn't expected to encounter any hostile forces out here. The world outside the facility was desolate, a wasteland from years of neglect. But this was different. These beings weren't scavengers. They weren't just wandering through the rubble. They were hunting. What do we do? Rian whispered, his voice barely audible. Erin pressed a finger to her lips, signaling him to remain quiet. The figures were closer now, just 100 yards away. She could hear the low, rhythmic clicking of their mandibles, the eerie sound sending a chill through her body. Their forms were becoming clearer, a blend of angular limbs, armor-like exoskeletons, and heads that seemed far too large for their bodies. Their faces were mostly hidden by the reflective surfaces of their helmets, but Erin could sense the intelligence behind those faceless visors. They were alien, but not in the way she had expected. She was about to say something when one of them suddenly stopped and turned, as if sensing her presence. The others halted immediately, their heads swiveling in her direction. A sense of dread washed over Erin, her senses flaring with the unmistakable feeling of being hunted. She grabbed Rian's arm, pulling him further into the shadow of the rocks. He barely made a sound, his breathing shallow. They had no choice but to hide and pray they weren't detected. The alien figures slowly advanced toward their position, their movements methodical and deliberate. It was clear they weren't just searching, they were looking for something specific. Erin's heart pounded in her chest, the silence between them becoming unbearable. She could feel Rian's eyes on her, his confusion and fear palpable. The weight of their situation pressed down on her. She had always been taught to avoid confrontations with beings like these, beings who had no regard for the fragile nature of humanity. But Rian wasn't one of them. She had to protect him. She would do anything to ensure his safety. Then, just as one of the aliens seemed to step closer, Erin felt a sharp tug at her consciousness, a pull, as if something inside her had connected with something outside. She could feel the energy of the bond between her and Rian reverberating through her mind, through her very being. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Her instinct screamed that it was more than just a connection. These beings, whatever they were, had sensed it too. They were aware of her.
Of them.
And they were getting closer. The tension stretched as long as it could. Then, the alien nearest to them took another step forward. Erin couldn't hold back any longer. Without warning, she sprang into action. "Run!" she shouted to Rian, her voice sharper than she'd intended. Rian didn't hesitate. He dashed from their hiding spot, moving faster than Erin had expected. His body, though still weak, was fueled by adrenaline and the instinct to survive. Erin followed closely, her own legs carrying her forward with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Behind them, the aliens reacted immediately. The clicking noise grew louder, more frantic. They had been spotted. And now they were in pursuit. Erin felt the wind whip past her, her bioluminescence flaring brighter in the growing darkness. The landscape around them blurred as they ran, the rocky terrain making their path treacherous. But it didn't matter. She couldn't stop. They reached a narrow ravine, a break in the otherwise flat landscape. The edge was steep, but it was their only chance to lose the aliens. They would have to climb. Erin reached the edge first, her hands gripping the rough stone. Without looking back, she began to climb, pushing herself up with every ounce of energy she had. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she didn't care. Not when Rian was behind her, not when they were still being pursued. Rian was right behind her, though he wasn't as swift. His breath was labored, his movements stiff from the earlier injury. But he didn't stop. Not once. "Keep going," Erin called over her shoulder, her voice ragged. "I'm right behind you." Rian called back, his words strained. Suddenly, a shrill, metallic screech pierced the air. The aliens were closing in on them. They had almost reached the ravine. Erin's pulse quickened. They needed more time. They needed a way to slow them down. Looking around, she spotted a jagged outcrop above them. Without thinking, she reached out with her mind, pulling from the bond she shared with Rian, feeling the energy surge through her veins. She knew what she had to do. With a sharp exhale, she pushed forward, focusing every ounce of energy into the stone above them. A massive rock shifted, groaning with resistance before breaking free. Erin's heart raced as the large boulder tumbled down the ravine, blocking the path below them. A burst of harsh screeching followed the crash of the boulder, but Erin couldn't wait. She and Rian had to keep climbing. "We've got to go," she urged, pulling herself up the final edge. Rian reached the top just as the alien figures reached the bottom of the ravine, their screeches echoing in frustration. But Erin and Rian were safe, for now. The ravine stretched ahead of them, a narrow and jagged escape route leading into a dense forest that seemed to swallow them whole. The world behind them had vanished into the chaos. Dust, debris, the relentless pursuit of alien hunters, and now there was only silence. For a moment, they stood together at the edge of the ravine, panting heavily, their bodies trembling from exertion. The boulder they had dislodged had successfully blocked the aliens, but it wouldn't hold them for long. They had no idea how long they could stay ahead of them. No idea where they were heading. Rian turned to look at her, his breath still shallow. "Are we safe?" he asked, his voice hushed but urgent. Erin scanned the forest, her senses alert for any signs of danger. "For now," she said, her voice tight with uncertainty. "But it won't last." Rian's gaze dropped to the ground as his hand instinctively reached for his side, where the broken pipe had been. But it was gone now, left behind in the ravine. A useless piece of metal, just like everything else. He needed more than a weapon to survive this. "What now?" he asked quietly. Erin felt the familiar weight of his gaze on her, but this time, something more lingered beneath it. There was no denying the bond between them, not anymore. They had been through too much together. It wasn't just the need for survival now. There was something deeper, something unspoken. She swallowed hard, trying to focus, to keep her mind clear. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice firm. "We need shelter, food, and something to defend ourselves." Rian nodded but didn't move immediately. Instead, his gaze lingered on her, as if searching for something more. The connection between them, between him and her, was more than just survival. It was an understanding, a recognition that they had become something more to each other than just two beings thrown together by fate. "Aaron," Rian began, his voice almost soft. "I don't know how to explain it, but I don't want to lose you. Not after everything." Her heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air between them, powerful and raw. She wanted to respond, but something in her chest tightened, making it hard to find the right words. Before she could answer, a distant howl reached their ears, a chilling sound that echoed through the trees. The pursuit wasn't over. They were still being hunted. "We don't have time for this," Aaron said sharply, turning on her heel. She needed to focus. Rian was important, too important, but they had no time for anything else. They needed to survive. Rian hesitated before following her, his expression a mixture of confusion and determination. "But you heard it, right?" he asked, voice strained. "We can't outrun them forever." Erin's eyes hardened, her steps quickening as she led them deeper into the forest. "We don't have to outrun them forever," she said quietly. "Just long enough." The trees around them were dense, the shadows cast by the setting sun making the world seem even more alien. They pressed forward, their movements cautious and calculated, knowing that every sound, every rustle in the underbrush could be their last. After what felt like hours, they came to a small clearing. The ground was soft with moss, and in the center stood a massive, twisted tree, its bark dark and gnarled. Erin stopped in her tracks, her breath catching as she scanned the area. "This is it," she murmured, glancing back at Rian. "We can rest here." For a short time, Rian nodded, though his gaze kept darting around, always on alert. "I still don't get it," he said, his voice distant. "Why are they after us? What did we do?" Erin sighed, her eyes moving over the treetops. She didn't have an answer. All she knew was that they had been targeted, but for what reason, she couldn't say. And the truth was, she didn't know if she wanted to know. "We didn't do anything," she said finally, voice hard. "They just know we're here. They can sense something. Our connection." Rian looked at her, confusion still clouding his features. "Our connection?" Erin took a step toward the twisted tree, her hand reaching out to touch the rough bark. It was cool to the touch, but there was a pulse within it, something that resonated with her. "Yes," she said softly, her fingers tracing patterns along the surface. "They know about us."
About me. About the bond between us.
Rian's breath caught, and he stepped closer to her, the weight of her words settling heavily between them. "You're saying they can feel us? Feel that whatever it is?" Erin nodded, though she felt a pang of guilt at the truth of it. She had never wanted to involve him in this, but now there was no denying it. She was the cause of the danger, and he had become tied to her fate. "They can sense it," she said softly. "It's why they're after us. They want something. They'll stop at nothing to get it." Rian took a step closer, his voice soft but insistent. "What do we do?" She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't have the answers. All she knew was that they had to keep running. They had to survive. And somewhere in the midst of all of this, there was a strange, undeniable pull between them, a connection that was growing stronger by the minute. "We keep moving," Erin said, her voice firm, even as her heart ached with the unspoken words she wasn't ready to say. "We survive. Together." Rian nodded, though his expression was torn. He wanted to say more. He wanted to ask her what this bond meant, what it could lead to. But they didn't have time for questions. Not right now. The sound of distant footsteps once again reached their ears, sharp and methodical. The aliens were closing in, and this time, there was no time to flee. Without another word, Erin turned toward Rian, her hands reaching out to him, pulling him close as she lowered her voice to a whisper. "Trust me, she said, her breath shaky with the weight of everything they had been through. We're in this together now, and I won't let anything happen to you. Rian's gaze locked with hers, his eyes full of questions, but also understanding. For a brief moment, everything else faded away. It was just the two of them, their bond, their survival, their future, whatever it would be. And then, with no more time to waste, Aaron led them into the shadows, ready to face whatever came next.